Lesson number 55 is all about complex fractions and the division rule for complex fraction. Now, the division rule for complex fractions is something you already know. Essentially, the division rule boils down to this. It's 3 steps. 1, 2, and 3. Those 3 steps, they're not very complicated. You know them. Copy. Dot. Flip. So the way that we've always worked with fractions is the same way we're going to work with complex fractions when we divide them. So our first problem, a divided by b all over c. Now what I like to do in these problems is make that central division bar bigger. So we know that we have a top fraction and we really have a bottom fraction as well because it's really c divided by 1. So the way we can do this with our complex fractions to divide is to say a over b divided by c over 1. And if we look at it this way, well, copy dot flip is going to help us get to the answer. So a over b times 1 over c. And when we have this, we'll come to our final answer because a times 1 is a, and b times c, well, that's just b times c. And again, this problem with the variables, it actually is easier than problems with numbers because we don't have to do the actual simplification. We don't need to multiply what b times c would ever have been if it were numbers, and then we don't have to reduce or divide to find our final answer. Now notice one thing in this problem. It says b comma c are not equal to 0. That's a key part of this problem because those are the only two variables that we cannot have 0 for to make this be true. Because if b or c was 0, then our answer would be undefined, because we can never divide by 0. So we need to put that out here as a disclaimer to begin with, that we don't want either of those to be equal to 0 in order to have our final answer. It doesn't affect our final answer in any way, but you need to know what that means. Let's look at our next problem. Here we have another complex fraction. A complex fraction is just a fraction within a fraction. So here we have a over x divided by b over a plus x. Now when we have these complex fractions, when they're stacked vertically, like they are originally in most of the problems, they look complicated. But if you just go ahead and write them out horizontally, then you know that if you copy dot flip, multiply by the reciprocal, you're going to get your answer. So we're going to get times a plus x, because we're going to use the reciprocal, over b. So now we've got our answer. We've got a times a plus x all over x times b. Now in this problem, you've got 2 ways you could report your answer. This is one of them. The alternative way you could report your answer would be to use the distributive property. A times a, that's a squared, plus a times x, that's ax, and that's all over xb. Now both of these get you full credit. I'll encourage you to stick with the first answer, because I know you know how to do the distributive property. But if you were asked to use the distributive property to expand out, we get an answer that looks like our second one below. Lesson practice will be on page 226. Make sure you've got your notes complete, and I'll see you during our next class.